All right. Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. My name is Josh. I'm director of the Urbit Foundation, and I'm happy to be here doing another developer call. This is an exciting time for all of us because next week, at least a whole bunch of us are going to meet in person at Assembly. So I hope that all of you will be there, and I'll get to see y'all. Sadly, the guest I'm interviewing today, Rob, is not going to be there. So I'm happy that we could do this ahead of time, and we'll project his spirit into Assembly and remember this talk, which is going to be really exciting. As I no doubt imagine that you've all seen, Urbit Visor hit the scene last week, right about the time that this big software distribution OTA hit as well. And so if you missed it, then that's okay because you're here. Urbit Visor came out of it came out of this grant proposal called Sign In with Urbit that in a call with Rob and Tim a while back, we were talking about this idea. Well, you should be able to use your Urbit to sign into some website, and it's kind of like an authentication mechanism, but I don't know, that always just felt kind of lame. And we, on this call, came up with a much more exciting idea, which was, well, what if you could get content out of your Urbit into just normal web pages, and bring Urbit to the web? That idea was way more compelling and way more interesting. And Rob and dcSpark, they took it and then they actually built it, and it morphed into something even much bigger than that called Urbit Visor. So I'm excited to have Rob here today, who can tell us all about this. Hey, Rob.
Hey, how's it going, Josh? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. I'm really glad we could do this. Tell me just a little bit about the journey to Urbit Visor, in more detail than I just gave.
Right. So taking probably a couple steps back compared to where you started the story. I've been in the Urbit community for about the past 2-ish years or so. And initially, at the time when I got into Urbit, I did university. I kind of got some basics of Hoon, and I started to look at where the ecosystem was at. And I felt that there was a lot of room to be expanded on in the direction of external applications. Because at the time, when I started, it was OS 0 and moving to OS 1. And you can kind of see landscape develop from this very base interface into something that's usable for everyday social interactions. And so I kind of started thinking that, hey, we have this really awesome peer-to-peer network that solves identity messaging and computation. I'm from more of a crypto background, and I've been doing that professionally for the past few years now. And I kind of saw there was a lot of opportunity at hand by bringing this, peer-to-peer network into the external space, and not just have Urbit be this, box that separates itself from the internet or from the rest of, the computation stack. So in desktop apps and so forth. And so the very first direction that I was excited about was building a Rust airlock, which was the very first grant that I did on my own in that case. And so I started looking at, hey, we have these great languages external to Hoon. So Rust is a language that's pretty good, and I'm pretty fluent in to some degree. And so I was starting to build that airlock. But that entire time I was building it, I kind of realized that the desktop environment is pretty subpar for the inter-application communication. And so when I looked at what would be the UX experience, so if I invested a bunch of my own time, or if in my company dcSpark we were to build a serious application that's a desktop application, what would be the UX for users actually to get on there? And I kind of came to a realization, right, that you're just expecting people to copy and paste their IP and plus code. That's really insecure, it's unsafe, and it's just not really a good experience. It'd be like, typing in or copy pasting your SSH keys to applications in the Unix context. And you're like, there's something inherently wrong there. That's not what you're supposed to do. But if that's the default experience, you can make it a config file where a person downloads through landscape, but it's still like it's not a good experience. And so despite the fact that I am not personally the biggest fan of web technology, JavaScript, TypeScript, yada, 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 I kind of thought about it because in my previous company that I worked at, we built a crypto light wallet called Yoroi. And so effectively, we had a lot of experience in the extension world and kind of the fact that you can communicate between extensions. And also you can communicate between extensions and web pages. And so that started to brew some ideas in my head that, people mock, the web browser is effectively like an OS in your OS. But one thing that the web browser got really well is that inter-application or inter-extension or extension to web page communication is like 25 years ahead of OS native app communication. Like when you write let's say like you have a crypto wallet and some other random application on your Linux or Mac desktop, there's really no good way to make them communicate securely so that like application A knows that application B is the actual application that receives the correct message, and that there's no like man-in-the-middle attack, that it's actually secure and you can like encrypt stuff, for example. You have no guarantees and you don't even have a good way for them to communicate. So people usually just create web servers and used to do HTTP gets, push, and puts to send data back and forth and acquire data. And so you're really using the web as a communication mechanism, communication mechanism between desktop apps. And pretty much that took me to the point where I realized, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like for thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, if we're going to build ecosystems of external applications on top of Urbit, yeah, there'll be some CLI applications, and I created some too, that allows you to, archive a bunch of your channels, for example, and that kind of stuff's always useful. But actual user-facing apps that have good UX, that's realistically not going to happen in the desktop environment unless we have a really good place for people to have a store for their credentials that keeps them safe, encrypted, and then easily allows other applications to interact with the Urbit ship without leaking those credentials. And that was kind of the very first step that got me to Urbit Visor.
That's a great realization. It's like there've been a number of, I think it's somewhat adjacent to this, of these attempts to figure out like, well, how do we bring Urbit to, like it's a little bit of a hermetic system. You get into Urbit and then everything is self-contained therein, but how do you get a glimpse into that world outside of it? How do you bring it make it more widely accessible? I don't know if this quite makes it more accessible, but it does make it much more applicable to a lot of places. Like I know you and I have talked a little bit about some of the possibilities for this, the kinds of applications you could see built through Urbit Visor, and they go, I think, a lot beyond just, here's a web application that is 100% based on Urbit. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, what are some of the possibilities with this that we can see getting into?
Right. So I think the simplest way to understand this is to look at it in 3 categories. And so the first category is web apps, like you said, and like I'll show off soon. We have Urbit Dashboard, the very first Urbit Web App. Besides that, you can also have the like login or sign in experience with Urbit. And so that's more, you have existing Web 2 websites, whether that's Google or Twitter, Reddit, et cetera, and you can use your Urbit ship as an auth mechanism. And that is interesting because, assuming Urbit wins in the end, you want these auth systems into existing systems. But in terms of like practicality and something that really opens up doors, it's a nice to have, but not the best thing ever. And so really the Urbit web apps are much more interesting. And that's why that's the first thing we're targeting. But third of all, the third category is also having Urbit Visor powered web extensions. And so what these are is effectively the idea, going back to the point I raised prior, where web extensions actually have the ability to interact with each other. And so that means you can send messages between web extensions, and you know that the message you're sending actually gets to the web extension you expect. specifically on Chrome. This is a lot easier than Firefox. And so that allows us to actually open up the door where anyone on Earth who knows some JavaScript or TypeScript can create their own web extensions. And if we effectively, we have to do some refactoring of Urbit Visor, but we already have this in the roadmap. But effectively, any web extension that anyone creates can talk to Urbit Visor directly, ask for permissions. And so Urbit Visor is like a safe firewall between a user's Urbit ship and the external web extension. And then that web extension can effectively bring the functionality and benefits of Urbit to the web, but it takes it with you everywhere you go on the internet. And so rather than, for example, just having one Urbit web app, like urbitdashboard.com, you could kind of argue this is kind of like landscape, just put somewhere else, right? It's just another web app. But UV extensions are effectively a novel way to experience Urbit no matter where you are in the internet. And so, for example, the very first UV extension, which we're going to be building, is a Twitter UV extension. And so what this will allow us to do is effectively, when a user installs the web extension, then anytime they go into Twitter, this web extension adds a bit of HTML, CSS, and a few icons into their current Twitter experience, and then enhances it with Urbit functionality. And so what that really means is that we're going to be providing users the ability to instantly share any tweets at the click of a button in the bottom right corner. You just have like a share on Urbit button. You click that, a modal will pop up with all your groups and channels, and you just choose which channel you want to share this with, click OK, and then it instantly goes to the web extension, from the web extension to Urbit Visor, and then through Urbit Visor, via the permissions that you authorize yourself, it then goes to your Urbit chip. And so you kind of have this pathway where we have this secure mechanism where Urbit Visor acts as the firewall that doesn't expose your credentials, but actually protects all of your data on your ship and acts as the middleman that makes everything safe. And in this way, we can get this brand new functionality. And so besides the share feature, we're also going to be looking to do like an unroll feature. And in the future, we might look at other potential for Twitter. As people start to use this, they get new ideas for what kind of functionality we can start to build. But in effect, this is a very first example of what kind of UV extensions can be made. And the really cool benefit of these is that it allows you to be on the existing web where all the content currently exists on the internet. And then you can easily pull that data onto your Urbit chip, which this Twitter UV extension shows that this is possible. And not only that it's possible, but people can actually have a really good and clean UX. And that's something that hasn't really been possible before with the web separated from the current Urbit experience.
All right. Well, I think with that, we should just get into the meat of your presentation. So let me turn this over to you. So you're going to show us some stuff. If you have questions during this, feel free to ask them in the comments. And Rob will either answer them as he sees them, if he's feeling like doing that right then, or I'll keep track of them and then we'll fill them at the end. Other thing to note, at the top of the hour, we're all going to go on to it. We're going to open up a Google Meet, anyone, as we usually do. Anyone can join that. You can talk to Rob, meet him, ask him questions, whatever you want to do. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into this talk.
Okay, perfect. So for those of you who haven't seen the Urbit Visor video that I released, effectively, I'm going to take us through the basic UX of Urbit Visor and also show off a few features that I missed the first run through. So Urbit Visor currently, you can find it on GitHub. You can actually go to urbitvisor.com and it'll take you here. And right now you have to compile it yourself, but in the near future, it will be on the Chrome Web Store. We're still waiting for the pending process to go through. So Urbit Visor, like I said, is a web extension. And this web extension lives in your browser and it effectively stores all the credentials for your various ships. In this example, I have one moon and one comet, which are running locally on my PC. And so what we can do at any moment is when you have these credentials added for a specific ship, you can connect to it. And so as you can see up here on the top right, now I have the sigil. And so I am officially connected. When this connects, it effectively opens an airlock connection. And so you have to type in your master password, and your master password is a password that you as the user sets. And so this encrypts all credentials of every ship, and so that they are never stored in clear text, but your ship IP/domain and your ship plus code are both encrypted at rest always. And so when they do get decrypted, they're simply decrypted, used to start a session, and then thrown away. And so it's never stored anywhere. So this is actually a much better experience compared to just copy pasting your Lux code everywhere, which is very dangerous. But and that's the default experience for external apps today, well, prior to Urbit Visor. So once you have Urbit Visor installed and you connect to a ship, no matter where you go on the internet, you have access to your Urbit ship. And so in this case, we have Urbit Dashboard, which is the very first Urbit Web App. And so Urbit Dashboard is designed to talk with Urbit Visor and effectively know when you're logged in, when you're logged out, if you have permissions accepted, or if you don't. And in this case, as you can see here, so if I connect to my ship, Urbit Dashboard detects that I have the airlock connection. And so then it talks with Urbit Visor. Right now it's doing some subscriptions and scries to acquire a lot of data from your Urbit ship. And then it populates the website itself with all of this data. Urbit Dashboard provides you with kind of a good first example from a developer standpoint of all the different functionality that you can implement with the existing Go apps that are installed by default, and with all of the data that's provided primarily through like the landscape experience. So with Graph Store, Group Store, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'll run through Urbit Dashboard and then come back to some final features, which I didn't show off prior in the initial Urbit Visor release video, just to show off all the different settings and also how exactly permissions work more in detail. So with Urbit Dashboard, effectively you have 5 pages here, and half of them are more developer focused and half of them are more user focused. So the ship activity page shows off the activity of your ship. In this case, I have 4 groups, 14 channels, 1,092 contacts, 3,513 unread. These are a bunch of popular groups I'm in. These are a bunch of unread messages that I have in the various groups. Down below, it's a more detailed version of these graphs. And effectively, this is to show off that, hey, we have the existing JavaScript and TypeScript ecosystems with so many components, templates, and so many things that we can just fork and reuse. And we have a lot of really useful data. And so if we try to move forward and provide better UX experiences for end users, it makes sense to reuse what's already made, have the data that we already have in Urbit. And then the third component here is to then build UV extensions, which bring more content from the current web onto your Urbit ship. And so then you can kind of have this triangle of existing Urbit content, brand new content, and a really easy way of displaying all that content, thanks to all of the current ecosystem for the web. And so we can really build new experiences that weren't as easy to do before because either one of these pieces were missing. From there, so the ship activity page, it's the pretty page to show off. You can do nice charts and so forth. But we also have pages that are quite practical. And so, for example, we have the admin panel. The admin panel allows developers and also end users who are curious or who may run into an issue, and they may have someone, say, like in the Urbit community help channel, tell them that they need to perform a certain scry or something. They can either do that scry in WebTerm or in Dojo, or they can also potentially do a poke here. And so this is more of a visual experience to performing the key fundamental actions within Urbit. So in our case, we can do a scry to Graph Store, for example, look at all of the different keys of all the groups I'm in. This returns the straight JSON. And so this is why this is more developer focused, because we're not trying to make everything pretty and nice. We're just trying to provide this really useful functionality where we have a lot of defaults implemented here. Or, if you have your own cool Go app you can just type it manually here, and so you can do everything manually, or have these defaults there for you. And this effectively allows you to get a good experience for testing out various actions with Gull apps, specifically for external devs. This can also be useful, external app developers. This can be useful for testing Hoon apps, or primarily Gull apps, Gull agents. But usually if you're already in the web term and doing stuff there, you're probably not going to be jumping here, but it is also another alternative in that case. And so in this case, you can also subscribe to GraphStore as well, whether you do keys or updates, and effectively your subscription data will come out down below. One cool thing is also that you can hot swap between ships. And so this is something that's brand new in regards to UX. That's not really possible via landscape and via grid, where you have to visit a specific IP or domain to see your ship. And if you want to jump between ships, you're effectively stuck jumping between different tabs. And you can't get this experience where you're on page A on ship A, and you want to still stay on page A, but go on ship B. You can't just switch at a moment's notice. But Urbit Visor provides that. And so, for example, now that we're on admin panel, I can disconnect from my moon, and then I can connect to my comet. And then just like that, the dashboard recognized that I switched ships. I reconnected to another airlock instance, and then I passed that all forward, and I'm already inside Urbit Dashboard. And now I can make this exact same scry, so the exact same user data that I inputted into the front end, into the web page, and also even local state can be stored right in the browser, even between hot swapping, which is not possible if you have two tabs, because those are separate instances. And so effectively, we have a brand new UX experience, and where you can even hot swap between 10 ships if you have all of them inside of Urbit Visor. And effectively, you can take data from one ship, move it into the local state of the web page, and then move that data to another ship for some use cases. Maybe you're implementing a protocol that uses a web app, and so you have to take data from one ship to then produce a secret, maybe sign it with a web wallet that integrates with Urbit Visor, and then you log in with a second ship, and then that second ship would be the one that performs the transaction or also signs it. So maybe you have like a 2 of 3 multi-sig between two ships you own. This isn't like the best use case example, but this is just kind of an idea for what is possible. And there's countless things past that are as well. Besides the admin panel, we also have the chat feed. And so effectively the chat feed is a GraphStore update subscription that filters for all of the chat updates and then displays them in a nice format. And so effectively, this is a good example for developers to see that, hey, that JSON that your ship spits out, you can also format it nicely. And here's kind of the way to do it. The next page we have in Urbit Dashboard is the troubleshooting page. And so this is more of a user-centric page, which allows you to get some either basic data about your Urbit ship. So for example, the grandparent of my comet is Zod, or it allows you to also get your plus trouble, and also trigger OTAs, kill spider threads, reset landscape, reset your ship, and so forth. So these are some basic buttons that, if something goes wrong, or you're curious who your sponsor is, and you don't want to go and ask an Urbit community, hey, what's the command to type in dojo to find out who my sponsor is? You can literally just print parent and find out who that is. So the troubleshooting page acts kind of as a higher level front-end interface to some of the admin panel default options. And then it just prints it out in a nice format so that end users can figure out what's going on with their ship. And so this is kind of a nicer way. For example, if you have someone who's new to Urbit, they have Urbit Visor installed, and something's going wrong, maybe an OTA isn't happening, maybe one of the desks isn't updating, you can just ask them, hey, go to this page, log in, click plus trouble, and then paste the output from it. The last thing we have in Urbit Dashboard is just a simple profile that shows off your sigil. In this case, it's a comment, so it has no sigil. And we can jump to my moon, which does have a sigil, and then it is uses the sigil, and now it's loading some data and then filling all of this out. As you may have noticed, the loading time for pulling some of this data is not always instantaneous. And a big part of that is because currently in Urbit, since there are no remote scries, and to my knowledge, the easiest way to acquire data from another ship is subscribing, majority of the Go apps expose all their data via subscriptions. But subscriptions require creating an SSE connection. And that's actually a lot slower through the airlock UX, or developer experience rather. It's a lot slower to do subscriptions and include the subscription compared to doing scries. And so to help try to mitigate that, one of the things we're going to be looking at in the near future is also to see what data exists in the current Go apps like Graph Store, Group Store, Hark Store, et cetera, and start to look at how can we build out better scries that expose all that data. So not just landscape, but pretty much any Urbit Web App, any UV extension that gets created in the near future, they'll have the ability to easily access that data and access it quickly. And so that's something which we're really looking forward to, is getting the developer experience to be better and better and better over time. Now, like I said, I showed off Urbit Dashboard, but let's also dive into some of the extra features of Urbit Visor. So one of the things I mentioned is that Urbit Visor is also a firewall, effectively, between Urbit Web Apps, UV extensions, and your Urbit ship. And so whenever you go on an Urbit Web App or a UV extension tries to talk to Urbit Visor, then you have to accept permissions. And so if I delete the permissions from my moon, as you can see, it logged me out here because it doesn't have permissions to do anything with my Urbit ship. And then if I click on Connect to Urbit Visor, it asks me to open up the extension and provide permissions. So these are the permissions: ship name, ship URL, subscribe, poke, and thread. And to add them, I have to type in my master password and click Grant. I also wanted to show off one of the settings we have, which you can find here, permission confirmation settings. We also offer a pop-up window option, which if you're more used to MetaMask, this is effectively what you more expect, right? You click on the button that says Login with MetaMask, and then you get, or submit transaction, and then you get a brand new pop-up window which has the permissions requested. And it's effectively the same experience as clicking through the icon itself. We wanted to offer users both experiences because some people prefer the pop-up. Some people may consider the pop-up to be more distracting. Say if you're like full screen on a Mac, it's not the best experience. And so with Urbit Visor, we're really focused on getting the UX to be really, really nice and like as best as it can, so that the user experience for Urbit web apps, UV extensions, is just this seamless experience that gets people excited about Urbit. And so we experimented in various different ways. And this is one of the experiments which we decided to offer both options, so that if some people like pop-ups like this, then they can use it. Otherwise, if they prefer the more manual option where they have to click through, that's also possible as well. So once you have your permissions here to grant, you can type in your master password and click Grant. Now that the permissions are granted, Urbit Visor emitted a event to Urbit Dashboard, letting it know, hey, you got permissions. Now you can do whatever you want to do, go through your basic page logic. And so this feature of Urbit Visor makes things a lot safer because you know exactly what every ship wants to do with your ship, what every web page or UV extension wants to do with your ship. And you can revoke specific permissions. You can revoke an entire domain, and effectively allows you to be very picky. And over time, we're also going to get this permission layer to be more advanced and more specific, so that it's not just, can Urbit Dashboard do a scry, so read data from all of your goal apps. Eventually, we're going to do it based off of specific goal apps and look at different ways of getting that permission layer to be more fine-tuned so that it's even safer for the end user. Going past that, we have a few other options or settings available. So you can remove ships from Urbit Visor. You can change your master password. And when you change your master password, this also re-encrypts all of the credentials of the ships you have saved in Urbit Visor. So this is effectively fully switching your master password over. And then we also have the option to reset Urbit Visor. So pretty much the settings are pretty simple. They allow you to just do basic management. And we focused on getting the UX of just using Urbit Visor with web apps and eventually UV extensions as streamlined and easy to use as possible. Also, as you may notice, this UI is not ideal. And so we are currently working with a designer in dcSpark who is redesigning all of the pages. So this is more of an MVP or beta of Urbit Visor. And probably in the next month and a half or so, we'll have brand new designs for Urbit Visor that will be implemented. And so you'll really start to see Urbit Visor grow from this, very first MVP, which is practical, it works. You can use Urbit Dashboard with your ship today to really smooth and nice experience that, will probably rival existing crypto-like wallets in UX, for example. We're not aiming to, be the best of the best in terms of UI, but we want to get things to the point where when someone sees Urbit Visor on your web browser and they see you, using different websites, they'll actually be really interested because it's a brand new experience. And then when you can, let them know, hey, this actually enables you to use the entire web with this peer-to-peer network that solves identity messaging and computation. That sounds pretty exciting for the nerdy types, at least. And so that's really what we're going for with Urbit Visor and with Urbit Dashboard, which we created as the very first web app. From here, I guess I want to focus a little bit more about the long-term vision for Urbit Visor, in that what we have today, I think, is pretty awesome because this offers a lot of new experiences. And like I said early on in this call, that we are focused on building out the UV extension experience. And so to move in that direction, we're also going to be building out, for example, libraries. And so we're going to build one library, which allows anyone who wants to build a UV extension to simply import the library, and it'll hard code all of the complex messaging layers, the extension ID of Urbit Visor, and kind of all the background details, and just simply provide a API that matches the API that gets injected from Urbit Visor into web apps, so that whether you're developing a Urbit Web App or a UV extension, the API that you have exposed to you is exactly the same. So we're trying to unify the experience between the two for developers, make it as simple as possible to build these. And then we're also going to be looking at building, eventually a component library. So, often many of the base use cases or how users interact with Urbit from a website might be sort of standardized. For example, when you want to share content or move content from the web to your Urbit ship, you have to know where to share it or where to archive it or where to store it. And so we're going to be creating modals, for example, that automatically talk to Urbit Visor for you, find out all the groups you're in, all the channels you're in. You'll be easily able to filter based off of just chat channels, just off of notebooks, just off of link collections, and then provide that to the user in a nice modal where they can either search or just select the one they want in a drop-down menu, for example, and have this really, nice and easy experience. And we want to offer that to other developers in component libraries, for example. So rather than having every single developer, whether they're a web app developer or a UV extension developer, have to re-implement that, they can just use the library and then implement their core logic that either uses data from Urbit, uses data from the internet, and then parses it and does something with it before passing it on to Urbit, and effectively allow people to have a very nice and easy experience in developing all of these different pieces of software. To add to that, we're also going to be looking at building out and wrapping a lot of the core Gull apps, Gull agents, with JavaScript, TypeScript interfaces. And so rather than people having to understand what a scry is, what a poke is, subscribe, thread, you'll instead eventually have, a graph store module, which simply allows you to, send a chat message, and the end user, the JavaScript developer, doesn't even have to understand how Urbit works at all. He just has an endpoint in an API that's created by Urbit Visor that hooks up the graph store and sends messages to a specific chat channel that they want to send a message to. I think it's really important for us, for the core Gull agents, or the very popular Gull agents that have these very basic primitives, like a data store, for example, like graph store, or maybe setting store, to have these interfaces wrapped so that when we have random JavaScript or TypeScript developers interested in Urbit, they can just go off on their own, read a tutorial, look at an example like Urbit Dashboard, and then try on their own and start to build these different and unique web apps and UV extensions that they wouldn't have really been able to do before, just because of the mental overhead and also the UX. And so Urbit Visor really solves the UX, and we want to bring the developer experience also up a level so that we can really allow users to have so much more power while not reinventing the wheel every single time, or even having to go through the hoops of understanding what's going on underneath. But they can just use the Urbit Visor API, use the library, and just get up and running very, very fast. And so with all that said and done, effectively what we're aiming for with Urbit Visor is to provide this experience for end users where the web browser really is a first-class Urbit client. It really does provide developers with a better experience. It provides end users with new functionality like hot swapping. And also, one of the last things that I do want to touch on is that we at dcSpark are also releasing a crypto light wallet called Flint Wallet. And our long-term vision is to also add Urbit Visor support to Flint. And so we expect that Flint will be the very first crypto wallet that will have direct interactions with the Urbit ecosystem, modulo the BTC wallet currently in Urbit, but I'm saying more so from like the web browser light wallet experience, and also having, because we're targeting various blockchains, so we're going to be focusing on Solana, we're also going to have Cardano, Ethereum eventually, and we're looking at other blockchains to support over time. And so effectively, through Urbit Visor and through Flint, we really do believe we can start to move in the direction of having Urbit not just be in its own world, but it can be brought over to the web, and also it can be brought over to various different blockchain ecosystems. And Urbit is a really great solution to all of the off-chain problems. And some of you may have seen, I wrote a Medium post, I think a month or so ago, talking about how Urbit is the off-chain solution that all the blockchains wish they had, but they just don't know they really need it or want it. And so over time, we're really moving that direction where Urbit has so much great functionality and has a lot of great primitives, but we really have to bring that over to the web, bring that over to blockchain, and make it easy enough for existing developers to be able to maximize, based off of their existing knowledge, to use that and take advantage of all the features of Urbit. And so that's effectively what we're really going for.
Cool. Well, that was great. I think we can go into QA now. Q&A, not QA. Sorry, I've been doing a lot of QA lately. Well, fantastic. I know we had one question that came up not too long ago from Brian about whether or not you can skim over the APIs for web developers real quick. It sounds like you're working on coalescing those a bit, but I imagine there's some existing ones.
Right, so I can show off all my screen share right now. So if you go to urbitvisor.com, it'll forward you to the GitHub page. And as you can see in the README here, so it's halfway down the GitHub page, we effectively currently wrap the airlock API, and we provide primarily two key additions. So number one is a permission layer, like I mentioned. So every one of the endpoints that we have, it says, does it require permissions? No, yes. And if it does require permission, when the user performs an action that uses that endpoint, Urbit Visor will automatically request for that permission. And so this provides developers a much easier experience where they don't have to like constantly check everything. They can also just try to use an endpoint and it'll automatically ask for the permission. The user can authorize and accept. Or we also offer a request permissions and a authorized permissions. So request permissions is an endpoint that specifically allows you to list a set of permissions, which is what Urbit Dashboard does. So when you try to connect to Urbit Dashboard, it asks for all the different permissions. So you only have to authorize once and not have a worse experience. Authorized permissions allows you to check which permissions that the user has authorized for your given web app or for your UV extension. And so this provides you with a nice clean interface for understanding what is the state of Urbit Visor from the perspective of the web app or UV extension that's trying to use it. And does that web app have the actual ability to do those actions? And so besides that permission layer, we also offer some useful event-based data. So for example, we have like is connected so that you know that the user is connected to an Urbit chip. And side note, currently airlocks seem to have random disconnections between 1 to 2 hours when they're online, and Urbit Visor automatically reconnects when it notices an airlock is disconnected. And so we provide a much stronger experience for developers in the fact that they know the airlock connection will be sustained, but we also provide this interface for knowing if the connection is still live or if the user disconnects. And this can be used, for example, for hot swapping, because when you know is connected was true and then is connected becomes false, but also we emit events from Urbit Visor when a disconnect happens. So you can either subscribe and read the events or ping the endpoint. So you effectively have the state of the user's ship available to you via the API. And the last part of the API that's a bit different is that when you want to subscribe to Gall agents on Urbit, we provide a .on endpoint, which allows you, you could say, a much simpler and easier to use experience for adding event listeners so that you can read data from Gall agents and then act upon them. And so effectively, we wrapped the airlock API. We provide some more permission layer, some more connection data, and then provide a simpler experience for subscribing to agents.
Awesome. That was definitely a great overview. We've got another question from Kenny. So people often speculate about what kinds of businesses could be built with Urbit. How can Urbit Visor be used for commerce? Or
right.
How do you think that might play into that picture?
So it depends, right? If you're thinking, some of you may know like OpenBazaar, which used to be a peer-to-peer exchange or like an eBay for blockchain effectively. You initially had Bitcoin, eventually Litecoin, Zcoin, I think, Zcash. And so if you're much more like geared towards the peer-to-peer perspective or the blockchain as a medium for exchange perspective, Urbit Visor can really fit in that because, centralized websites like eBay, for example, always run into issues where they take a cut. Anytime you have a centralized middleman, they end up taking a cut. They end up selling your data, yada, yada, yada. You know the spiel. And so theoretically, Urbit Visor, if there's some existing UIs, maybe like OpenBazaar or some other eBay-like clones that are open source, technically, you could fork that code base from GitHub, integrate with Urbit Visor, integrate, say, with a crypto web wallet, like Flint Wallet eventually. Then you can start to have, this peer-to-peer commerce where the actual data for the interactions between people lives in Urbit. And so everyone talks to each other. So you don't have anyone snooping in the middle. You don't have anyone taking a cut in the middle. And so you can actually, do the peer-to-peer exchanging or the negotiation of the peer-to-peer exchanging directly on Urbit through Urbit Visor. And so from the user's perspective, just in their web page, but then have all of that settle on a blockchain. And for example, Urbit Visor can allow you to have data which you received from messages between each other, or just messages between Gull agents from your Urbit ship and their Urbit ship, to the web page, and then from the web page to MetaMask, to Flint wallet, and pretty much provide a seamless experience where the user doesn't have to, like open MetaMask and type in $502 convert into Ethereum. All that data can be automatically generated from the Urbit ship and just be dumped at the web page and then pulled into MetaMask. And you can effectively potentially envision commerce moving in that direction if you think a peer-to-peer commerce future is in the cards.
And then wind chimes can be safely purchased. Yeah, so it seems like a big part of this is, and this kind of goes back to the content of your blog post, is that Urbit provides this great layer that you can't quite get on blockchain that augments what you end up needing for these services that are focused on commerce to work properly. But now you don't need, with Urbit, you don't need the annoying middlemen that capitalize on the glue, so to say, that makes the financial transactions work in the first place. There's a question I have. There's this idea I've been thinking about for a long time that I'm curious if maps well onto, kind of the solution space that Urbit Visor exposes. I think it might. I've thought for a long time it'd be really cool if I could go to some arbitrary web page and I could then overlay that page with a discussion from people that's going on in Urbit. I could say like, okay, there's some page I found on Twitter. I go to some URL and I've got some group of friends in Urbit and I say, hey, let's have a discussion about this, but we do it on the web page. Right. We read this thing and then we have our sidebar discussion right there, our comments on the page right there. And so essentially I get an overlay of the internet as I browse different parts of it with discussions that are happening there.
And so, that was one of the ideas I also thought about. And the cool part of that is, depending on how you do it, if you want to do a global feed, it gets a bit more tricky because who's the person who hosts the global feed and how do you find them in the first place? And so,
this is the discovery
if you want
problem.
to be, and so if you have a discovery problem, so if you make this sufficiently advanced enough, you can create a Gull agent that a bunch of people run and they act as indexers. And so then you have people, effectively key value. So the domain or the specific, maybe IP plus, depends how you do it, but you can do domain forwarded to a specific group or a set of groups. And so people can register to have their group or their channel in a group specific for that domain. And then you can have like a choice of, okay, there's 5 people who said, who opened groups for this domain. You can check this discussion, this discussion, this discussion, and they have different titles. And so you can kind of do an indexer scheme, or you can just have it more personal. Because, let's say we have like some pals and you have a group of people who you trust. You can choose, hey, I want to discuss with 6 friends. You can just automatically create that and then have that inlined. And, whenever some of your friends have this domain and they can store it on their local ship, and then your ship cross-references with their ships and see, okay, when I visit domain X, do any of my friends have domain X also? What are their comments? And then you inline them based off of, history, like dates. And so it's like all this stuff is very possible and not even that hard. There's just kind of like, small pieces that need to be duct taped together, so to speak. And not just duct taped together, but like actually, connected together in a nice solid fashion. And with a bit of design and a bit of time and effort, I think that's totally doable. And we can start to see more and more stuff where data from Urbit overlays onto the existing internet, data from the existing internet moves back into Urbit. And so you kind of have this unified experience from both ends.
I think you're going to have there's a representative from dcSpark. I think your co-founder that's going to be at Assembly, right?
Yep. So our CEO, Nico Arcaros, will be Assembly.
Okay, great. Yeah, as we go into Assembly, and for those of you that are here and are into Urbit Visor, one of the things we want to do at Assembly is assemble things. We want to build stuff. So, think about using Urbit Visor and the kinds of applications that can be built with this, because I think there's a ton of them, and the space is clearly very unexplored. There's a lot of cool stuff we could do. On that note, like the big thing that happened there are actually multiple big things that happened last week. Urbit Visor was one of them. The other one was that we shipped this, big OTA that mostly worked for most people, which added, some exciting new capabilities to your experience on Urbit. Right now, software can be distributed peer-to-peer. I'm curious to know how you think that new set of infrastructural capabilities on Urbit plays into what can be done with Urbit Visor. What does the marriage between those two look like?
Yeah, so one of the great things about software distribution is that it really simplifies the process of getting solid goal agents onto your user ship. And so for current use cases, most people can get away with the existing goal agents, the goal apps that are included by default, but often that won't always be enough. And so then the two use cases to bring up there is that people might want to create a very complex protocol that maybe requires a specific goal agent with Hoon code that's very unique to their use case. Maybe they need some sort of data structure that's unique. Maybe they do some weird new crypto, et cetera, et cetera. And so that makes a lot of sense for people to deploy those as brand new goal agents that are unique and for their specific app, and then serve those from their ship, and then allow anyone when they install their UV extension or visit the Urbit dashboard and they provide permissions to then install that piece of software, that goal agent, from the ship that's serving it. And so effectively, you can get that same experience as what we have with Urbit Dashboard, but maybe it'll take 20, 30 seconds longer because you have this very first init process where it's installing the software from the target ship. And then once it's installed, it's on the user ship, and then you're good to go. And the web app or the UV extension can function as normal. And so you can have a very seamless and clean experience for the user, but still provide all of these, unique goal agents. However, I think in the near term, at least in my opinion, some people may disagree, I think we're going to start to converge on goal agents as generic backend applications. And so what that means is that, let's say half of the use cases we explained today rely on using your Urbit ship as a storage mechanism with permissions that you can share that data you store with some subset of other users, your friends or people you care about, and then have that be easily accessible. And so, for example, GraphStore is really useful for that today, but there's some situations where a graph-based database might not be perfect. And so I think in the future, it'd be great to have a really easy way to have a more generic database that's more relational, for example, and have that as a primitive goal app that, if you have a use case that's less social and more about storing data in a schema that it works better in relational databases over graph-based databases, then having a primitive or having a basic goal agent that's just a relational database that's well used, so it's checked by hundreds and maybe thousands eventually of Hoon developers who all looked at the code base. It's gone through many updates, and it effectively provides that experience of storing data in Urbit. I think having these primitive goal agents, such as a relational database, will be really key so that when we have new JavaScript or TypeScript devs come into the ecosystem, they don't have to recreate a brand new goal agent for every time they want to store data. They just know, okay, I want social stuff, GraphStore. Okay, I want something more relational, whatever that agent's going to be called. And so I think we can start to flesh out some of these really basic and key agents, and then you have the ability for users who don't understand Urbit fully, but can start building on top of it. And I think that has a lot of value. And the ease of use of installing all these goal agents, thanks to the new updates, really, really emphasizes that this is a possibility for the near future.
Yep. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We've seen that with GraphStore, that it has become the generic data store for like all the applications really that are most of the applications that are provided by what we now call groups. You still tend to need a schema, right? You need something that says, okay, well, you got this general purpose database, but you need to arrange its data in such a way that an application understands it, which definitely lightens the load on a goal agent developer a lot, because now they can just think in terms of a schema and not how to optimize their data storage. So I think, I imagine what this experience might look like, if I understood you correctly, was, maybe you go to some web page that's not Urbit Dashboard, but it's something else that requires an Urbit experience. It says, log in with Urbit Visor, you log in, it says you need these agents, or you need basically this package to be on your ship in order for it to work. And I imagine you could have Urbit Visor actually send the install command straight to your Urbit, install the software, then the page unlocks, and now you're interacting with it. So
Precisely.
yeah, you go straight to page. It could be a link that you find on the clear web. And there's no, central Urbit interface, right, that you first go to and then fan out. So, that's definitely a very different model than what Grid gives you, but there's also no reason that those two can't just live side by side.
Precisely. And that's why we also do offer users a button to go to Grid instantly from Urbit Visor, so that, it's this unified experience and it's not like one or the other, but we can get the best of both worlds.
Yeah. This should be a pretty quick question, and it looks like there was a little discussion that happened about it, but when Firefox?
Right. So the initial goal was to have both Chrome and Firefox support. And right now we're diving into the practicality of arbitrary extensions in Firefox talking to Urbit Visor. And so in terms of implementing the base feature set of Urbit Visor, we can do Urbit Web Apps without a problem in Firefox, and we know that's possible. And we assumed it would not be too hard to do in Firefox UV extensions, but we're still unsure if that's actually the case, because it looks like you might have to whitelist external extensions in like a manifest file for Firefox extensions. And so what that means is that if you create a random UV extension, that UV extension might not be able to talk to Urbit Visor unless you, like on our GitHub repo in the manifest, put in your Firefox extension ID. And then that really kind of destroys the seamless experience, right? Which you assume, okay, you find a Firefox extension or add-on and you install it, and then it works with Urbit Visor. And so because of that, we think that is the case, but we still have to do more research if there's some sort of workaround. Because of that, if that is indeed the case, unfortunately, I think we might just have to pass on Firefox, or maybe just have it's a trade-off. Do we want to do only Urbit Web Apps for Firefox? That doesn't really sound like a great experience, but it also sucks not to have Firefox support. And so, yeah. So we're still deciding on that, but that's the state of affairs. Yep.
Got it. Thank you. And I actually missed this one before, but I actually think we ended up talking about it anyway. This was basically what we just talked about. Was
right. Yeah.
How do these things co-evolve? And well, actually pretty naturally.
Just to talk on this in regards to dApps themselves, I think for people who aren't like deep in the crypto space from a developer perspective, many people don't realize just how much of a focus on off-chain is currently the predominant push. And so I think really more and more and more web dApps from Ethereum, from Solana, from all these various ecosystems are going to really start to try and figure out this off-chain experience. And so once we have Urbit Visor, probably let's say 3, 4, 5, 6 months out, get better and better and get that API really easy to use, we can start to pitch this to more crypto ecosystems and say, hey, we know your DAO on Ethereum is wasting tens of thousands of dollars doing on-chain multisig. What if you move your DAO to off-chain multisig inside of an Urbit group, run through Urbit Visor? That's a seamless experience. And then you can actually start to convince people, hey, Urbit is actually a good solution for your blockchain problems. And I think that'll really start to be possible probably in like a 6-month timeline when we really iron out all of the kinks to get it seamless.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. I think we're, once your UV extensions start to land and we can see those, we'll probably see you again on a developer call. Probably the first of many. Looking forward to continuing to work with you on this. I think this has the potential to become a really key part of the Urbit ecosystem. And with that, we should all go talk to Rob in this link that I just posted in the comments. And there it is for redundancy. Let's go ahead and jump onto that meet link. You have the opportunity to just hang out and talk to Rob for a little while. So with that, thanks, Rob. Thanks everybody for showing up. And we'll talk to you shortly.
See you there.